scaffolding that was set up, and Jane, the greatest woman I know, climbed all the way to the top to take photographs.
Oh,
So,
I couldn't miss that opportunity. It was incredible.
So maybe some of this information is redundant if you've read that welcome sign, and maybe some of it's behind me here, but this sculpture was commissioned by the Skowhegan Hospitality Association in 1966. They later morphed into what is now the Chamber of Commerce. Bernard Langlais worked on it for several years, and it was installed and dedicated in 1969. So at that time, it was recorded as being 62 feet tall and weighing 24,000 pounds. And the fascinating thing about this is, obviously, it's a very large piece of work. He built this in Cushing on site where he lived. And some of the photographs, the early photographs, were remarkable. That the ladders were all homemade ladders. There wasn't an aluminum ladder in sight. And so for a man basically on his own to do this that way is fascinating. And another thing that struck me, you know, especially when you're up there and you're seeing the scale of this, is that he engineered all this himself. And here it stood all this time throughout all the elements, the wind, the rain, the snow. I find that aspect of this sculpture probably the most fascinating of all, that he figured out how to assemble these large pieces of wood, and look how long they've been here. And one of the questions that while we were here working, a lot of people spoke up and said, oh well, if we're going to do this much work to the sculpture, we should move it. We don't like the location, it should be down by the river. Well, this site was chosen for this piece of urban art by a committee that the Skowhegan Hospitality Association had formed, and one of the most influential participants in that committee was a photographer, a well-known photographer in Skowhegan named Lyndon Huff. And because he had an eye for photography, he said this was the perfect spot, because it could be photographed from a parking lot where there was plenty of area for people to come and park their cars and get out, and there are no wires or, you know, interference in the background. So that's why it's here, and it's stayed here, which I'm happy to say. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a project timeline. I became involved on the project in 2003 and had a site meeting here with Ron Harvey of Tuckerbrook Conservation, who the Chamber had hired to do an assessment of the sculpture. And so I met with him. He actually coordinated a paint analysis to be done in 2004, and that was done by Susan Butt, a conservator and paint analysis out of Virginia. And then Ron Harvey of Tuckerbrook hired a structural engineering study, which was completed by Resurgence Engineering out of Portland. So in 2006, I came here and rented a lift and measured a lot of the elements that were beyond repair. So some of, you know, it had been here since 1969 with virtually no maintenance done to it. So the right forearm, many of the fingers, both of the feet have deteriorated beyond saving. So because you can't just go to the store and buy wood of these dimensions, it was in 2006 that I came and took all these measurements. And the following year, I went into the forest behind my house and cut down about 110-year-old hemlock tree that had a nice straight trunk, and I had it sawn into the necessary pieces, and we put those in a building undercover with plenty of ventilation, waiting for those to dry, which took 3 years. They were really too big to transport and take up time in a kiln, so we air dried them. So during this time, from 2003 right up through 2012, fundraising was taking place, to do this project. And one of the most difficult things was just accessing the work. There's so much needed to be done, from replacing certain sections to reinforcing sections. There was a lot of rot. So we needed a really good scaffold to get at every inch of the sculpture and basically touch every inch of it several times. So we got estimates from that, from Seacoast Scaffolding out of Portland. And I'll just fast forward. We started the project in 2014. We had a beautiful setup. One of the most unusual things about the scaffold was that normally a scaffold that's 6 stories high attaches to the building. In this case, they couldn't attach it anywhere to the sculpture. So we had a complete ring of scaffolding all the way around it. And the scaffolding was anchored by 4 large concrete ballast blocks. There was one over here, there were 4, one on each corner, and 2 in the back, and big steel cables. And even with those, the scaffold moved in the wind a little bit. But it provided us really good access to what we had to do. So it was a very enjoyable project. The view from up there is spectacular. I could see the house that I grew up in up on Main Street on the other side of the river. And I did keep a little tally on what some of the materials we used. So a lot of the original sculpture, look at the way it's constructed, a lot of the layers of the skirt assembly are layered almost backwards. They don't shed the water. There's a lot of butt ends that are exposed. So we wrapped all those with lead flashing. The top of the head is covered with lead flashing. We ended up using 156 pounds of lead flashing, 780 pounds of epoxy grout. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. 165 pounds of stainless steel wire mesh. And you don't really see that. It's up underneath the legs and up where the shoulders are. And that was installed to keep the squirrels from nesting inside. Yeah, they loved it in there. We used 19 gallons of paint and primers, 42 linear feet of 5/8 inch galvanized bolts, and 80 borate rods, which were drilled and inserted into mostly the horizontal elements to prevent rot from continuing. One of the biggest surprises that we found when we had this all apart, the legs are made up of 2, I think they measure about 14 inches square beams that go up to an intersection about where the right forearm is in the center. And that's where the neck beam, makes up the neck, the head assembly, runs down and goes in between the 2 legs. And those are all bolted together. So we had to climb up in there to clean out all the nests and leaves and everything that had accumulated in there. And while inside there, we noticed an area of rot on top of one of those leg beams. So on the outside of the beams, he took thick half slabs of wood that still had a round section on one face, and he bolted them onto the legs to give them a rounded appearance and to give them better proportion to the rest of the sculpture. So we removed all those half round slabs, and when we did, on the bottom of the sculpture's left leg, we found a hole that had rotted with ants going in and out. So we spent that entire day clawing at that hole with crowbars and hammers. The hole got longer and longer. Pretty soon it was almost the width of the beam, and we realized that it probably went up to the rot at the top. And sure enough, we took steel bars and started poking down from the top, and the ants started pouring out, and we realized that that entire leg was hollow. Luckily, the thing had not collapsed, because in some areas the hole was 6-8 inches in diameter, and then it might taper down smaller, and in other areas it got bigger again. So we spent that whole day with long pieces of rebar from the top and flexible rods from the bottom, just pounding away, trying to get rid of any loose material, and at the same time filling a shop vac full of ants. I've never seen so many ants. So what we did to repair that, we poured in liquid boracare, which is a borate solution, to stop the rot. And then we inserted steel rebar and wired that into a ring about 4 inches in diameter. And then we mixed the 780 pounds of liquid grout. It's actually liquid epoxy, like you would get from the hardware store, but a much higher tensile strength. And you mix that with a special type of sand. So it poured like lava. And it took quite a while, because to access the upper leg, the only way in was through the back of the sculpture, where we had removed part of the skirt. And it's really tight in there, very small area. So we were mixing it in a hod, 5 gallons at a time, then had to fill 1 gallon pails to dump into the small hole from the top. And filled that whole leg full of steel and epoxy. So we've joked that someday, maybe 100 years, 200 years, when the whole thing rots away, there'll still be this epoxy. Weird looking thing that may become the new sculpture. So that's pretty much the gist of it. It was a very exciting, rewarding project to be part of. One of a kind, and I'll always be thankful to have been part of it. So if anybody has any questions for me, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Does the staff or whatever do any swaying in the wind up there? And how does the wind affect it?
Well, it moves a little bit. If you can see right now, the spear, that metal spear, I mean, that is so heavy that 4 of us could barely pick it up. We had to have a crane here just to set the spear back in place. One thing I left out, a lot of the wooden elements of what is called the weir, which represents a fishing net, a lot of those pieces were rotten also. And a friend of mine who's also a woodworker came to me one day and said, I realize you're doing the Indian sculpture, and I know from just looking at it you're going to need some new parts for the weir. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, I have the perfect trees. I said, you do? And he said, yeah, come with me. So I met him at his house, and we went in his four-wheeler. He owns property along the Kennebec River, and he brought me to this site where there are these hemlock trees growing right on top of ledge. I mean, it's all a big outcropping of ledge, and somehow these trees have taken root and got enough nourishment with just a little bit of topsoil and the roots going down into the cracks of the ledge. So some of those round logs that you see there are 80 years old. That's how tight the graying is and how slow those trees grew. So when we cut the first one down and counted the rings, I was like right in heaven. I said, this is perfect. These will be really stable and last longer than anything you could go buy. Any other questions?
Can you see her from the back?
Pardon?
Can you see her from the back? Is she?
The sculpture?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can go around to the back and see it.
Yeah.
In fact, in the back, you'll see, you can kind of see a little bit better the skirt, its dress, how it's all assembled. Here you try to see it through the weir, but you can see how long some of the pieces of hair are. I can remember handling those. I mean, just a finger, is this square and that long. The proportions of it, though, I thought were really well done. It's a fascinating piece of work. It really is.
Here?
Yes. I aware of it at the time. That, as you know, I didn't come down here. I've seen pictures of it. They brought it here from Cushing on a flatbed truck.
I know, I was here.
So you were.
I saw the whole thing. Yeah, it was.
Well, rumor has it, and I don't know for certain, but somebody said the first crane that they brought here wasn't big enough,
I think that's true.
and they had to bring in a bigger crane to lift it off the flatbed and stand it up.
I think everyone was shocked at how big it is when it arrived here in town. I remember
Yeah, I
that.
bet they were. I bet they were.
And there was a lot of controversy, as you know, on where it was going to be placed,
Yeah.
and that it wasn't an Indian on a horse with a tomahawk, you know.
Yeah.
But this is truly what the Skowhegan Native Americans look like, which I think is just a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I agree.
And you did a terrific job on it.
Well,
I've
thank
been
you.
here where the squirrels were running up and down.
And birds and
And it was awful. It really was. So, nice job.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's exciting to be
Thank you.
with a lot of Langlais enthusiasts because
Yeah.
I just really enjoy all of this stuff. The further than this sculpture was at Colby College. I can't remember the year, but they had a showing there called Bernard Langlais, The Middle Years. And it was all devoted to much smaller work than this. He hadn't really gravitated to large outdoor sculptures. It was more mosaics and one-dimensional wall hangings, paintings, and I found that fascinating. And so then to become part of this Langlais Trail is really, really exciting.
I'm going to throw a question out here. How many pieces to that football hoop that they'll see later, and how you did that one?
Well, that one is much more complicated in this than it is spread out, and I believe there was about 68 primary pieces, if you don't count individual cleats that were put into the shoes, things like that. But we had to go to Cushing and dismantle that and record every piece and take a bazillion photographs, and we brought it back. At the time I owned the former Grange Hall over there and the tan building, and we took a portion of that building and actually turned it into a kiln, and we stacked all of the football player pieces, and a lot of those are beams 18, 19, 20 inches square and were soaking wet. I mean, they'd been outside for decades. And so we stacked them in there and ran 2 dehumidifiers and fans for an entire winter to dry out the pieces before we could even start working on them. And a lot of those were completely hollow. We filled those with a different method because most of those weren't structural, they weren't supporting things. So we filled those, clawed out all the rot, made sure it's dry, treated it with Boracare, and then we filled it with closed cell foam. It's like styrofoam, but it's a lot denser and it can't absorb moisture. So each piece of closed cell foam we would fit, then take out, dip it in water just briefly, just enough to get a little moisture on it, even though it doesn't absorb it, tuck it into place. And right before we tucked it into place, we'd paint the whole thing with Gorilla Glue and then shove it into place, and then the Gorilla Glue expands. And so we filled these huge voids with foam and Gorilla Glue.
You have any stories about the mermaid?
Oh, which story? That one was...
Or what is it? Woman with a Tail, I guess is the official name.
Have they seen that one yet?
No, they're going to, and I just wanted, if there's, the history and the background.
Well, that
on
one
it.
was in really bad shape too. The whole torso was completely rotted. Part of the tail was rotted. But that one was a lot fewer pieces, so it was a little easier to deal with. One of the harder ones, though, was the basketball player, which you'll see up at the community center, because that one was cast into a concrete base like this, but the 2 telephone poles that make up the basketball players' legs were cast right into the cement. And even though the cement had deteriorated, we tried to jackhammer it apart, and it was just such an effort. And then we realized as we got the cement chipped away that the legs were rotted below the concrete. So we had to cut those off, and we had to completely dismantle that one too and bring it back here. And so those we sistered new legs with kind of a half-flat joint, and U-shaped steel was bolted on both sides of the legs to be able to cast them back into a new concrete base. That one's really tall. That one must be, I'm gonna guess 25 feet tall. Nothing like this, but it was still a challenge to take it apart and then get it back here and put it all back together.
How about sitting girl and falling woman? Any issues with them?
Those I just helped facilitate the move to get them here, but they didn't require any work.
Except sitting woman's controversial because of the bolts.
Yeah, both of
Yes,
those.
it is.
Oh, both of them.
You don't hear so much about it anymore. I guess
Oh,
people are
okay.
getting used to
They're
it.
getting used to it.
Oh, Lord.
But, yes.
This is might be a silly question, but do guards like to sit and do share the base to the, what do you do about that?
Well, there's not much you can do.
Okay, I didn't know.
You know, I left, the Chamber of Commerce is the owner of the sculpture. So when we completed the restoration in 2014, I left them a maintenance schedule and recommendations. And as part of that, it's to inspect, put up a ladder and inspect the base for any evidence of ants or squirrels living in there. If there are squirrels, you'd have to hire someone to trap them and relocate them. And if there are ants, you'd have to find the source and put out poison and stop them before they do too much damage. Whether the chamber is doing this maintenance, I don't think they are, to be honest, and I wish they would, because it really should be inspected every year, and every 5 years they should rent a lift and just touch up the paint.
Right.
If they do that, if they keep ahead of it, it could last forever. But if they let it go again, it's going to be a much more extensive repair job. So.